My brother-in-law covered the Thanksgiving food I cooked with glitter because it looked boring, so I made him eat every single glittered dish while everyone watched. I'd been hosting Thanksgiving for my husband's family for 6 years straight. Every year I'd cook for 3 days, making everything from scratch because my mother-in-law Agnes taught me her recipes before she passed. This year was supposed to be special because it was the first holiday after my sister-in-law Janet got engaged to her boyfriend Keith. Everyone was excited to celebrate together. My brother-in-law Francis was bringing his new boyfriend Colton, who none of us had met yet. Francis had been difficult ever since Janet got engaged. He'd make snide comments about heteronormative traditions and how engagement parties were outdated displays of ownership. When Janet showed her ring, Francis said diamonds were basic and showed off the vintage watch Colton bought him instead. Everything was a competition with Francis, but we all ignored it because that's just how he was. The day before Thanksgiving, I started cooking at 4 a.m., made Agnes's cornbread stuffing that takes 6 hours. The turkey went in at dawn with her special herb butter under the skin. I made 5 different pies because everyone had favorites. Green bean casserole, sweet potatoes with the marshmallow topping, homemade cranberry sauce, rolls rising on the counter. The whole house smelled amazing. Francis showed up early saying he wanted to help. I should have known something was wrong because Francis never helped with anything. He walked around the kitchen asking what everything was, touching lids, opening containers. He kept saying the food looked boring and traditional, that Colton was used to more sophisticated cuisine. He actually said my gravy looked like beige sadness. I told him to either help or leave. He chose to leave but said he'd be back with something to make dinner more festive. Thanksgiving morning, I put the finishing touches on everything. The table was set with Agnes's china, the food was perfect, and family started arriving. Francis and Colton came an hour late. Colton seemed nice, but Francis immediately started criticizing. The table was too conventional, the centerpiece was uninspired, the music was depressing. He announced that he'd brought something to jazz things up since I clearly didn't understand modern entertaining. He pulled out this huge bag of what he called culinary glitter, said it was edible and would make everything Instagram-worthy. I told him absolutely not, don't touch my food. He laughed and said I needed to stop being so uptight, that food should be fun and celebratory. I went to get everyone seated. When I came back to start bringing out dishes, Francis was in the kitchen alone. Every single dish was covered in glitter. Gold glitter on the turkey. Rainbow glitter mixed into the stuffing. Silver glitter all over the pies. He'd even put pink glitter in the gravy boat. The rolls had edible glitter painted on them with what looked like corn syrup. Everything sparkled like a craft store exploded. Francis walked out smiling and announced he'd elevated dinner to match the festive spirit. He actually took a bow. My husband Robert tried to scrape glitter off the turkey, but it was everywhere. The stuffing looked like a disco ball. The mashed potatoes were purple from the glitter bleeding. Janet started crying because this was supposed to be her first family holiday with Keith, and it was ruined. Keith looked horrified. My father-in-law Carl said we should just order pizza, but nothing was open. Francis said we were all overreacting and the food was still edible, just more fabulous now. He took photos saying this would go viral as the most extra Thanksgiving ever. Colton looked embarrassed and whispered something to Francis about going too far. Francis told him not to start acting like everyone else. I stood up and said if Francis thought the food was so fabulous, he should eat it. All of it. He laughed and said that was ridiculous. I said either he eats what he ruined or he's never welcome at another family event. Robert backed me up. Janet said Francis needed to take responsibility. Carl said it was fair. Francis said we were being homophobic and punishing him for being different. Colton actually spoke up and said this had nothing to do with that, and Francis was just being an ass. Francis looked shocked that Colton wasn't taking his side. I started serving Francis plates. First, the glitter turkey, sliced thick with extra skin where the glitter was concentrated. Francis tried to refuse, but what Carl said made him stop. Carl cleared his throat and the sound cut through the room like a knife. Everyone froze with forks halfway to mouths or glasses suspended in midair. He looked straight at Francis and his voice came out steady and cold. If Francis truly believed the food was fine to eat, then he needed to prove it by consuming what he had ruined. The whole table went completely silent. You could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen and someone's watch ticking. Francis looked around at everyone staring at him. His face went pale, all the color draining out until he looked gray under the dining room lights. His eyes moved from person to person, searching for someone who would defend him or tell Carl this was too much. Janet looked away. Keith studied his empty plate. Colton sat perfectly still beside him with his hands folded in his lap. Robert met Francis's eyes and didn't blink. Nobody was going to save him this time. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, my hands shaking with anger as I grabbed a clean plate from the cabinet. I started loading it with thick slices of glitter-covered turkey. The gold flakes caught the light as I piled them on, each piece sparkling like costume jewelry. I added the stuffing that looked like a disco ball. Rainbow glitter mixed throughout so every spoonful glittered. I brought the plate back and set it down in front of Francis with enough force that the china rattled. Francis tried to laugh it off, his voice coming out high and nervous. He said this was ridiculous, that we were all being dramatic about some harmless glitter. Robert told him to start eating since he had been, so sure the food was still good. Robert's voice was quiet, but there was steel in it that I rarely heard. Francis picked up his fork with a hand that trembled slightly. Francis cut into the turkey and brought the first bite to his mouth. The moment it touched his tongue, he started coughing. The glitter coated his mouth and throat, and you could see him trying not to gag as he forced himself to swallow. He reached for his water glass and drank half of it in desperate gulps. Gold flakes floated on the surface of the water, spinning in tiny circles. Colton sat frozen beside him, his face pale and his eyes wide with horror. Francis took another bite and then another, chewing slowly like every swallow hurt. Glitter stuck to his lips and the corners of his mouth. His eyes were watering. I went back to the kitchen and served him the mashed potatoes next. The purple shimmer made them look toxic, like something from a science experiment gone wrong. I set the plate down and watched as Francis stared at it. He took a bite and his face twisted. He ate 3 more bites before his hands started shaking so badly he could barely hold the fork. I glanced across the table and saw Janet with tears running down her face. Keith held her hand tightly under the table, his knuckles white from gripping so hard. Janet wasn't looking at Francis. She was staring at her empty plate like she wanted to disappear into it. 20 minutes crawled by with only the sound of Francis chewing and drinking water. He had eaten portions of 5 different dishes by then. Glitter covered his face and hands and the table around him like he had been rolling in craft supplies. His lips were stained multiple colors from the different glitter shades. Pink from the gravy, gold from the turkey, rainbow from the stuffing, purple from the potatoes. He kept drinking water, but his mouth clearly felt coated and wrong. He would swallow and grimace and drink more water. The gold flakes kept floating in his glass. Every time he set it down, glitter transferred from his hands to the stem. Colton suddenly pushed his chair back and stood up. The legs scraped against the hardwood floor, breaking the awful silence. He said this had gone far enough. His voice shook. Francis was wrong to ruin the food, but this punishment was cruel. Robert told Colton to sit down. His voice came out hard and angry. Francis needed to face consequences for once in his life, instead of charming his way out of everything or playing victim until people felt sorry for him. The tension between them crackled across the table. Colton stayed standing. Robert stayed seated, but his jaw was clenched tight. Carl put a hand on Robert's shoulder but didn't say anything. Colton slowly sat back down, but he looked sick. Francis made it through the green bean casserole before his body finally rejected what he was doing to it. He started gagging, his whole body heaving. He pushed back from the table so fast his chair tipped over and clattered to the floor. He ran to the bathroom and we could all hear him getting sick. The sound echoed through the house, wet and awful. Everyone sat in uncomfortable silence. Janet was crying harder now, her shoulders shaking. Keith whispered something to her, but she shook her head. Carl stared at his hands. Robert stared at the wall. Colton covered his face with his hands. I sat there feeling my anger burn, but also something else starting to creep in at the edges. When Francis came back to the table, his face was pale and sweaty. Glitter still stuck around his mouth and in his hair, catching the light every time he moved his head. He looked like he might pass out. I pointed to the sweet potatoes with their marshmallow topping now covered in silver glitter, the cranberry sauce sparkling with red glitter, and the 3 different pies still waiting on the sideboard. I told him he was not done yet. Something in his expression finally cracked. The cocky smile was completely gone. The attitude had drained away. He looked at me, and for the first time all night, he looked genuinely scared. Francis's voice came out small and broken. He said he was sorry. He said he did not think about how much work I had put into the meal, or how much it meant to me. He said he just wanted to make things special and fun, and he got carried away. But I was so angry that his apology sounded hollow. It sounded like he was just trying to get out of consequences, trying to say whatever would make this stop. I told him to keep eating until every glittered dish was gone. My voice did not sound like my own voice. It sounded cold and mean. Carl's hand came down on the table hard enough to make the dishes jump. He said that was enough. Francis had learned his lesson, and this was becoming cruel. I snapped back that Francis had ruined 3 days of cooking. He had destroyed Agnes's recipes, the food she taught me to make, the traditions she passed down. Carl's face went hard, and the grief in his eyes cut right through me. He told me not to use his dead wife to justify revenge. The word revenge hung in the air between us. That was what this had become, and we both knew it. Carl's voice cut through everything. I served Francis the sweet potatoes next, the marshmallow topping stained silver from glitter. He picked up his fork, but his hand shook so badly the fork clattered against the plate. Janet pushed back from the table and ran to the bathroom. Keith followed her without a word to anyone. Francis took 3 bites of the sweet potatoes before he gagged again. He covered his mouth with his napkin and sat there breathing hard through his nose. Colton stood up and said he was calling an Uber. Francis looked at him with panic in his eyes and said they came together. Colton said Francis could figure out his own ride home. The Uber notification pinged on Colton's phone 8 minutes later. He walked out the front door without saying goodbye to anyone. Francis sat alone at the table surrounded by glittered dishes. I brought out the cranberry sauce next. The red glitter had turned it into something that looked like it belonged in a craft project. Francis stared at it and tears started running down his face. The glitter around his mouth and on his cheeks caught the tears and made streaks of color down his skin. He took 1 bite and pushed back from the table. He ran to the bathroom and we heard him getting sick again. The sound was worse this time, wet and painful. When he came back, his face was gray. Robert stood up and said that was enough. Francis had learned his lesson. I looked at the pies still sitting on the sideboard, untouched and covered in glitter. 3 pies I'd made from scratch using Agnes's recipes. Francis stumbled to the couch in the living room and lay down. Nobody said anything. Janet came out of the bathroom with red eyes. Keith had his arm around her shoulders. Carl started clearing plates without looking at anyone. Robert joined him and they carried dishes to the kitchen in silence. I sat at the table staring at the mess. Glitter covered everything. The tablecloth sparkled. The china had glitter stuck to the edges. Even the floor around Francis's chair glittered where particles had fallen. Janet and Keith left through the front door. Janet didn't hug me goodbye. Keith didn't shake Robert's hand. They just walked out and got in their car. Carl finished in the kitchen and came to get his coat. He looked at Francis still lying on the couch. He looked at me. He didn't say anything, but his expression said everything. He left and closed the door quietly behind him. Francis got up from the couch 30 minutes later. He walked to the front door like he was drunk. Robert asked if he was okay to drive. Francis said he'd call a rideshare. He left without his coat. Robert and I cleaned up. We scraped glittered food into the trash. We hand-washed Agnes's china because I couldn't put glitter in the dishwasher. We worked side by side without talking. The silence felt heavy and wrong. Robert wiped down the table 3 times, but glitter kept appearing. I vacuumed the dining room twice. We finished cleaning at midnight. The house smelled like turkey and cleaning products and something metallic from all the glitter. I sat down at the kitchen table. Robert sat across from me. We looked at each other. I opened my mouth to say something, but nothing came out. What I'd done hit me all at once. I'd made Francis eat until he vomited. I'd made him do it in front of his whole family. I'd used Agnes's memory to justify it. Robert reached across the table but didn't touch my hand. He pulled his hand back and stood up. He said he was going to bed. I sat in the kitchen alone for another hour. The next morning, my phone was buzzing on the nightstand. I picked it up and saw 17 missed calls. The family group chat had 247 new messages. I opened it and started scrolling. Janet had posted at 2 a.m. that her first holiday with Keith was destroyed. She said she'd never forget watching her brother get humiliated at what was supposed to be a celebration. Carl posted that I'd crossed a line and needed to think about what kind of person uses food as punishment. Francis's friends were in the chat somehow. Someone named Jun called me abusive. Someone named Tiffany said forcing someone to eat until they vomit is assault. Robert was sitting on the edge of our bed staring at his phone. His shoulders were hunched forward. I asked if he'd seen the messages. He didn't look at me. He just nodded. I started to explain that Francis ruined everything first. Robert stood up and walked to the bathroom. He closed the door. I heard the shower start. I went back to my phone. More messages kept coming in. Francis had posted his version on Facebook. He said his family punished him for being himself. He said they made him eat contaminated food as revenge. He posted pictures of the glittered dishes. The comments were full of people saying his family was toxic. Robert came out of the shower 20 minutes later. He got dressed without looking at me. I asked what he was thinking. He sat down on the bed and put his head in his hands. He said Francis was wrong, but what I did was cruel. He said watching his brother get physically sick while the family watched felt like something out of a nightmare. His voice cracked on the word nightmare. I tried to explain that Francis needed to face real consequences for once. Robert shook his head. He said there's a difference between consequences and revenge. He said I'd made everyone watch something nobody should have to see. He stood up and said he needed to go for a drive. He left and I sat on the bed with my phone. The messages kept coming. I wanted to defend myself, but my hands were shaking too hard to type. My phone rang Friday morning. Jacqueline's name appeared on the screen. I'd posted something vague on Facebook about Thanksgiving being a disaster. I answered and Jacqueline asked what happened. I told her everything, the glitter, the ruined food, making Francis eat it. Jacqueline went quiet. The silence stretched out for so long I thought the call had dropped. I said her name. She asked if I really made someone eat until they vomited while their family watched. Hearing her say it like that made my stomach turn. I tried to explain about Francis's pattern of behavior, about how nobody ever holds him accountable, about Agnes's recipes being ruined. Jacqueline interrupted me. She asked if making someone physically sick solved anything. She asked if I felt better now. I didn't have an answer. Jacqueline said she loved me, but she couldn't support what I did. She said she needed some time to process this. She hung up. I stared at my phone. Even my best friend thought I was wrong. I spent the weekend in the family group chat. I typed out long messages explaining Francis's history, the time he showed up 2 hours late to Carl's birthday dinner, the time he criticized Janet's engagement ring, the time he told Robert his job was boring at a work event. I explained that Francis gets away with everything because he's charming, because he plays victim, because the family always forgives him. Janet responded Saturday night. She said her engagement was supposed to be celebrated. She said instead she watched her brother get humiliated. She said maybe both Francis and I are the problem now. That message sat in my chest like a stone. Robert read it and looked at me. He didn't say anything, but I could see the agreement in his eyes. Carl posted Sunday morning. He said the family needed space from both Francis and me. He said Christmas plans were on hold until everyone calmed down. I felt panic rising in my throat. I'd hosted every holiday for 6 years. The idea of not hosting Christmas felt like being cut out of the family. Robert came home from work Monday looking exhausted. He dropped his keys on the counter and loosened his tie. I asked how his day was. He said his coworker Kelvin had heard about our Thanksgiving. Apparently Francis posted about it on social media, calling it abuse and painting himself as the victim. Robert's face was red with anger. He said Francis was playing victim online after what he did. But then Robert's expression changed. He said people at work were asking if I was okay. He said the story sounds unhinged when you hear it from the outside. He said his boss pulled him aside and asked if everything was all right at home. Robert went to the bedroom and closed the door. I stood in the kitchen realizing that Francis's version was spreading, that people who didn't know us were hearing his side first. My phone buzzed Tuesday afternoon. A text from Colton. He said he needed to understand what happened because Francis's version didn't match what he witnessed. He asked if we could meet for coffee. I stared at the message for a long time. I was curious what Francis had been telling him. I was curious if Colton saw through the victim act. I texted back that I could meet Wednesday afternoon. Colton sent me the name of a coffee shop across town. I got to the coffee shop early Wednesday. Colton was already there, sitting at a corner table. He looked tired. I sat down and ordered coffee from the waiter who came over. Colton didn't waste time. He said Francis has been spinning the story as homophobic punishment. He said Francis claimed I targeted him for being gay and different. My mouth fell open. I said the glitter had nothing to do with his sexuality. It had everything to do with him ruining my cooking. Colton nodded slowly. He said Francis is good at making himself the victim in every situation. He said this isn't the first time Francis has caused drama, and then rewritten the story. Colton leaned back in his chair. He said he's been dating Francis for 8 months. He said this isn't the first time Francis has caused drama, and then played victim when facing consequences. He said Francis told him his family was conservative and judgmental. He said Francis painted a picture of a family that didn't accept him. But what Colton saw at Thanksgiving was a family trying to celebrate together until Francis made it about himself. Colton said he watched Francis deliberately ruin my cooking, and then act surprised when there were consequences. He said the homophobic angle only came up after Francis got in trouble. I asked Colton why he was telling me this. He looked down at his coffee cup. He said because he's trying to decide if he can stay with someone who treats people this way, and then lies about it. He said Francis has been talking about Agnes constantly, comparing everything to how she would have done it, comparing Colton's cooking to hers, comparing his apartment to her house. Colton said he thinks Francis never processed his mother's death properly. He said the grief is coming out in weird ways, making Francis need attention and control, making him compete with everyone around him. I sat there taking in what Colton was saying. Francis's behavior suddenly looked different through this lens, not just bratty and entitled, but broken and grieving. I drove home from the coffee shop thinking about everything Colton said. Francis always acted dramatic, but the way he talked about Agnes constantly, comparing everything to her standards, that was new. Or maybe I just never noticed because I was so busy trying to live up to those standards myself. When Agnes taught me her recipes, she made cooking feel like love, like I was learning a language that would help me belong in this family. After she died, those recipes became my way of keeping her alive. But maybe Francis needed his own way to grieve, and I never gave him space for that. I pulled into our driveway and sat in the car for a while. Robert's truck was already there. He'd gotten home early from work. I walked inside and found him sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop closed in front of him. He looked tired. I asked if he wanted dinner, but he shook his head. He said Kelvin asked him today how things were at home. Apparently, people at work were still talking about our Thanksgiving. Robert said Kelvin told him that forcing someone to eat until they vomit crosses a line no matter what they did first. I sat down across from Robert and told him about meeting Colton, about how Francis has been having nightmares about Agnes and feels like he disappointed her. Robert was quiet for a long time. Then he said his family always made excuses for Francis. Said it was harder for Francis being gay in their conservative extended family. Said Francis was the baby and needed more understanding. Robert admitted that watching me make Francis face consequences felt good at first, like finally someone was holding Francis accountable. But then Francis started gagging and Robert felt sick watching it happen. He said it felt satisfying and horrible at the same time. I asked Robert if he thought I was wrong. He said we were both wrong. Francis was wrong for ruining the food, but I was wrong for how I responded. He said the problem is his family never taught Francis how to handle consequences in a healthy way, so when consequences finally came, they were brutal. We talked until midnight about Francis and Agnes and family patterns. Robert cried talking about his mom. He said he misses her every day but pushes it down because he's supposed to be strong for his dad and siblings. He said watching me cook her recipes is beautiful and painful. Sometimes he resents that I became the keeper of her traditions when he's her actual son. Friday morning, my phone rang while I was making coffee. Janet's name lit up the screen. I almost didn't answer, but I knew avoiding her would make things worse. I picked up and Janet said she needed to talk about Christmas. My stomach dropped. She said Keith proposed they host Christmas this year. Give everyone a fresh start in a neutral location. I felt hurt immediately. I'd hosted every holiday for 6 years. But Janet said she can't risk her wedding planning being overshadowed by more family drama. She needs this Christmas to be peaceful for Keith's sake. His family is already nervous about marrying into our family after hearing about Thanksgiving. I told Janet I understood but felt punished for setting boundaries with Francis when he started the whole thing. Janet went quiet on the phone. Then she said, making someone eat until they vomit isn't setting boundaries. It's revenge. She said she loves me, but can't pretend what I did was okay just because Francis was wrong first. Her voice cracked when she said watching her brother get humiliated at her engagement celebration was traumatic. She said both Francis and I ruined that night and now she has to figure out how to plan a wedding while managing family conflict. I apologized for ruining her celebration. Janet said she knows I'm sorry, but sorry doesn't undo what happened. She said she needs to know I won't retaliate if Francis does something annoying at Christmas or her wedding. I started to defend myself but stopped. What could I say? That I wouldn't humiliate him again? That felt like a low bar. Janet said she'd text me details about Christmas once she talked to everyone. She hung up before I could respond. The weekend dragged. Robert was distant and quiet. He went to his dad's house Saturday afternoon and didn't come back until evening. When I asked how Carl was doing, Robert just said fine and went to watch TV. Sunday morning, I tried to make pancakes but burned them because I couldn't focus. Robert ate them anyway without complaining. By Sunday night, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I asked Robert directly if he was angry with me. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said he's angry at the whole situation. Angry at Francis for being selfish. Angry at his family for enabling Francis his whole life. Angry at himself for not protecting me from family dysfunction. But mostly he's disappointed that I let Francis make me into someone cruel. That word hit me like a punch. Cruel. I'd never thought of myself as cruel. I thought I was finally standing up for myself, setting boundaries, making Francis face consequences. But Robert said cruel people always have reasons that make sense to them. He said he married someone kind and generous, someone who cooked for his family and honored his mother's memory. But the person who made Francis eat glittered food until he vomited wasn't that person. I started crying. Robert hugged me, but it felt mechanical, like he was going through the motions because that's what you do when your wife cries. I couldn't stop replaying Francis's face when he was gagging. The way his hands shook holding the fork. How everyone watched in uncomfortable silence. I made an appointment with a therapist for Tuesday. I found someone named He Curtis who had availability. I needed to talk to someone neutral about whether I was the villain in this story. Tuesday afternoon, I sat in He's office. It was small with comfortable chairs and plants everywhere. He was younger than I expected, with short black hair and glasses. She asked me to tell her what brought me in. I explained the whole Thanksgiving situation. The 3 days of cooking, Francis covering everything with glitter, me forcing him to eat it while everyone watched. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked what I was feeling when I decided to make Francis eat the glittered food. I said I was angry. But as I talked, I realized it was bigger than anger about that one dinner. I was furious about years of Francis's behavior going unchecked, about him making everything a competition, about his snide comments and drama at every family event, about nobody ever telling him no or making him face real consequences. I wanted him to finally understand consequences in a way he couldn't dismiss or laugh off. He wrote something in her notebook. Then she said public humiliation rarely teaches the lesson we want it to teach. She said what I actually did was give Francis ammunition to play victim and avoid accountability for his original action. Francis can now tell everyone he was abused and punished. People will focus on what I did instead of what he did. He asked if I felt satisfied with how Thanksgiving turned out. I had to admit I felt sick about it. She said that tells me something important about my choices. She said anger is valid, but how we express anger determines whether we're setting healthy boundaries or seeking revenge. I left her office feeling worse than when I arrived, but also more clear about what I'd done. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, Janet texted asking if I'd come to her house to talk about Christmas and her wedding plans. I drove to her and Keith's apartment on Saturday afternoon. They'd just moved in together last month. The place was small but nice, with boxes still stacked in corners. Janet opened the door looking nervous. Keith was sitting on the couch and he stood up when I came in. They both looked serious. Janet offered me coffee, but I said no. She sat down next to Keith and took his hand. Then she said she wants Francis at her wedding but needs to know he won't cause a scene. I felt defensive immediately but kept my mouth shut. Janet said she's planning to have a conversation with Francis about boundaries and expectations, about respecting her day and not making it about himself. But she needs to know I won't retaliate if he does something annoying. I said I only reacted because Francis literally ruined an entire holiday meal. Keith spoke up quietly. He said my reaction ruined the holiday more than glitter on food did. I stared at him. He barely knew me and he was judging my response. But then I thought about what he said. The meal could have been salvaged. We could have ordered pizza. People would have been disappointed, but we could have moved past it. What I did to Francis made the whole evening about punishment and humiliation instead of family and celebration. Janet was crying now. She said she was so excited to celebrate her engagement with family. She'd been planning what to wear and what to say. But instead, she spent the night watching her brother get sick while everyone sat in horrible silence. She said both Francis and I ruined that night, and now she's scared about her wedding. Scared Francis will do something dramatic. Scared I'll overreact. Scared Keith's family will think we're all unstable. I apologized to Janet and Keith for ruining their engagement celebration. Janet started crying harder and said she'd been so excited to celebrate with family. She'd picked out a special outfit and practiced what she wanted to say about Keith. Instead, she spent the whole night watching her brother get sick, while everyone sat there in awful silence. She said both Francis and I ruined that night, and now she's terrified about her wedding. Terrified Francis will do something dramatic. Terrified I'll overreact. Terrified Keith's family will meet us and think we're all crazy. Keith pulled her close and rubbed her back while I sat there feeling like garbage. I'd been so focused on punishing Francis that I never thought about how it affected anyone else. Janet wiped her eyes and said she loves me, but she needs to know I won't make her wedding about Francis's bad behavior. I promised I wouldn't and meant it. I drove home feeling worse than I had in weeks. That night I couldn't sleep and kept replaying Janet's tears. Robert was quiet beside me, and I knew he was thinking about it too. Carl called me Friday morning. His voice was kind, but I could tell this wasn't going to be easy. He asked if I'd meet him for lunch on Saturday at the diner near his house. I said yes, even though my stomach dropped. I knew Carl wanted to talk about what happened and about my role in the family. Saturday came too fast. I got to the diner 10 minutes early and sat in a booth by the window. Carl arrived right on time and slid into the seat across from me. He ordered coffee and waited until the waitress left before he spoke. He said Agnes would have been heartbroken to see her recipes become the center of family conflict. That hit me hard because I'd been telling myself I was honoring Agnes by defending her cooking. Carl said Agnes taught me those recipes because she trusted me to bring the family together the way she always did. Not to use food as a weapon when someone disrespected my work. I felt tears starting and tried to blink them back. Carl kept talking in that calm way of his. He said Agnes dealt with Francis's drama for 30 years and never once humiliated him in front of everyone. Even when Francis deserved it. Even when he pushed her buttons on purpose. She always found a way to handle him with love instead of revenge. I started crying right there in the restaurant. The waitress brought our food, but I couldn't eat. Carl was right, and I'd been using Agnes's memory to make myself feel better about what I did. Agnes would have been disappointed in me. She would have found a way to set boundaries without making Francis sick in front of his new boyfriend. Carl handed me napkins and waited while I pulled myself together. Then he said something that surprised me. He said Francis has been impossible since Agnes died. The whole family has been too gentle with him because they're grieving and feel guilty. They've all been enabling his behavior because losing Agnes made them scared of losing each other too. But that fear made Francis worse instead of better. He said the family walks on eggshells around Francis and it's not helping anyone. I asked Carl what he thought I should do now. He said I need to apologize for how I handled things while still saying Francis's behavior was wrong. He said the family needs to learn how to hold Francis responsible without being cruel. And that starts with me showing them how to do it right. I drove home thinking about everything Carl said. That night, Robert and I sat on the couch and talked for 2 hours. I said we should call Francis and apologize for the public humiliation while still addressing what he did wrong. Robert admitted he's been avoiding Francis because he's angry, but also ashamed. He said part of him enjoyed watching Francis face consequences for once, but another part of him felt sick about it. He said he needs to deal with his own complicated feelings about his brother. We decided to wait a few days before reaching out to Francis. We both needed to figure out what we actually wanted to say. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, Jacqueline invited me over. I hadn't seen her much because I'd been avoiding everyone. When I got to her house, Knox was playing with blocks in the living room. Jacqueline made tea and we sat at her kitchen table. She said she's been worried about me because I seem obsessed with proving I was right about Francis. Every conversation circles back to Thanksgiving and how Francis started it. Jacqueline said I need to separate 2 things in my mind. Francis being wrong doesn't make my response right. I can acknowledge both things at the same time. She said I keep trying to make one cancel out the other, but that's not how it works. Wayne came home from work while we were talking. He grabbed a beer from the fridge and joined us at the table. He said something I hadn't thought about before. He said Francis's behavior at Thanksgiving might have been his way of trying to help, because he feels bad compared to my cooking. Wayne said men sometimes break things when they feel like they can't do them right. Francis might have really thought the glitter would make things better instead of worse. That idea had never crossed my mind. I'd been so sure Francis was being mean on purpose. But what if he was trying to contribute something special and just did it in the worst possible way? What if his Instagram comments about making things fabulous weren't about showing off, but about trying to add something to a celebration where he felt useless? I sat there at Jacqueline's table thinking about Francis differently for the first time since Thanksgiving. Maybe his actions came from feeling left out instead of wanting attention. Maybe he saw me cooking all of Agnes's recipes and felt like he had nothing to offer. That didn't excuse what he did, but it changed how I understood it. I drove home from Jacqueline's house thinking about Francis in a completely different way. Wayne's words kept playing in my head about men breaking things when they feel like they can't do them right. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for 10 minutes just staring at my steering wheel. The glitter incident might not have been about making me look bad or stealing attention. Francis might have actually thought he was helping. He might have seen all my cooking and felt useless and tried to add something special in the only way he knew how. The execution was terrible, and he should have asked first. But maybe his heart wasn't as mean as I'd assumed. I went inside and started making dinner even though I wasn't hungry. Chopping vegetables gave my hands something to do while my brain worked through this new understanding. Francis had always been dramatic and over the top. That was just who he was. But since Agnes died, the drama had gotten worse and more destructive. Maybe he was acting out because he didn't know how else to deal with losing his mom. Maybe covering the food with glitter was his grief coming out sideways. I thought about all the things Francis said about feeling different and not fitting in. He'd say it like a joke, but there was always something sad underneath. Agnes was the one who made him feel okay about being exactly who he was. She never tried to tone him down or make him more normal. When Francis came out in high school, Agnes was the one who stood up to the extended family members who had problems with it. She was his safe person. And now she was gone, and Francis was lost. Robert came home around 6 and found me sitting at the kitchen table with a half-chopped onion in front of me. He asked if I was okay, and I told him about my conversation with Wayne. Robert sat down across from me and listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he told me something I didn't know. Colton had reached out to him that afternoon asking questions about Francis and Agnes. Robert showed me the text messages on his phone. Colton said Francis was having nightmares about his mother almost every night. In the dreams, Agnes was disappointed in him and telling him he wasn't the son she wanted. Francis would wake up crying and couldn't go back to sleep. Colton said Francis talked constantly about feeling like he'd let Agnes down by not being more successful or more stable or more something. The Thanksgiving incident happened right after Francis had one of those nightmares. Colton thought the glitter was Francis trying to prove he could make things special and beautiful, trying to show he had value to contribute to the family. Reading those texts made my chest hurt. I'd been so sure Francis was being mean on purpose. I'd made him eat until he threw up because I thought he was trying to humiliate me. But he was struggling with grief and feeling worthless, and I'd punished him in the worst possible way. I told Robert we needed to have a real family conversation about Agnes and grief. Clearly nobody was handling her death well if Francis was having nightmares and I was forcing people to eat glitter food. Robert agreed, but then said something that surprised me. He admitted he hadn't properly grieved his mother either. He'd been so focused on being strong for Carl and his siblings that he never let himself fall apart. Watching me cook Agnes's recipes was both comforting and painful for him. Sometimes he felt good seeing her traditions continue. Other times he resented that I'd become the keeper of her memory when he was her actual son. That confession hit me hard because I thought I was helping. I thought taking over Agnes's recipes and hosting traditions was a gift to the family. I never considered that Robert might feel replaced, or that his siblings might feel like I was taking something that should belong to them. We sat at that kitchen table and talked for 3 hours about things we should have discussed 2 years ago when Agnes died. Robert said he sometimes felt like a stranger in his own family now. I hosted the holidays and cooked the recipes and told the stories about what Agnes taught me. His dad came to me with problems instead of to him. Janet asked me for advice about wedding planning because I knew what Agnes would have wanted. Francis acted out because he felt like nobody understood him the way his mom did. And Robert was stuck in the middle, feeling like everyone had moved on without him. I asked Robert why he never told me any of this before. He said he didn't want to seem ungrateful or like he was competing with me. He knew I was trying to help and honor Agnes. But watching me step into his mother's role made him feel like he'd lost her twice. Once when she died, and again when I took over her place in the family. We both cried at the table while dinner burned on the stove. I apologized for not seeing how my actions affected him. He apologized for not speaking up sooner. We talked about how everyone in the family had been performing their expected roles instead of actually dealing with grief. Carl played the strong patriarch who held everyone together. Janet played the responsible daughter who kept the peace. Francis played the dramatic problem child who needed attention. Robert played the stable son who never caused trouble. And I played the perfect daughter-in-law who preserved Agnes's legacy. But none of us were actually okay. We were all just pretending, and the cracks were starting to show. The Thanksgiving disaster was just the biggest crack so far. The next morning, I woke up thinking about Francis differently. I got my phone and typed out a text asking if he'd meet me for coffee. My finger hovered over the send button for 5 minutes before I finally pressed it. 3 hours passed before Francis responded with just the word, "Okay," and a coffee shop address. We agreed to meet Thursday afternoon. That gave us both 3 days to prepare for what would clearly be a hard conversation. I spent those 3 days thinking about what I wanted to say. How could I apologize for my cruelty while still addressing that what he did was wrong? How could I explain that I understood his grief now without excusing his behavior? How could we move forward as family members who didn't destroy each other? On Wednesday, I had a therapy session with He that I'd scheduled the week before. I told her about my upcoming meeting with Francis and all the new information about his nightmares and grief. He helped me separate my genuine hurt about the ruined dinner from my anger about years of watching the family enable his behavior. She said I needed to focus on moving forward instead of relitigating who was more wrong. The past couldn't be changed, but the future relationship could be different if we both chose to make it different. Thursday afternoon, I drove to the coffee shop 20 minutes early and sat in my car rehearsing what I wanted to say. Francis showed up exactly on time, looking terrible. He had dark circles under his eyes that were visible even from across the parking lot. His clothes hung loose like he'd lost weight. When he got closer, I could see his face was thinner and his hands shook slightly when he reached for the door. We ordered coffee and sat at a table in the back corner away from other people. Francis spoke first. He said he was sorry for the glitter incident and he knew it was disrespectful and stupid. He'd been feeling sick about it since Thanksgiving night. His voice cracked when he talked and he couldn't make eye contact. I watched him struggling to get the words out and felt my anger dissolving into something sadder. This wasn't the confident, dramatic Francis who took a bow after covering my food. This was someone who looked broken and scared. I told Francis I was sorry for humiliating him publicly and making him eat until he got sick. I said my response was cruel, regardless of what he did first. Francis started crying right there in the coffee shop. He said he deserved what I did for ruining all my work, but I told him nobody deserves to be humiliated in front of their family. I regretted handling it that way. We sat there both crying while other customers pretended not to notice. Francis wiped his eyes with a napkin and said he'd been having nightmares about Agnes. In the dreams, she was disappointed in him and he couldn't make her proud. He covered the food with glitter because he wanted to contribute something special to the celebration. He wanted to prove he could make things better instead of always making things worse. He didn't think about my feelings or the work I'd put in. He just saw a chance to do something and took it without considering the consequences. I told Francis that talking with him helped me understand things better. We needed to figure out how to be family without hurting each other all the time. Francis wiped his eyes with another napkin and said he wanted that too, but didn't know how to stop messing things up. I said we both needed to change, that I couldn't just stay quiet when he did something disrespectful, but I also couldn't respond by trying to destroy him in front of everyone. Francis nodded and said he understood, that what he did at Thanksgiving was terrible, and he knew it. We sat there for another hour talking about Agnes and how much we both missed her. Francis told me stories about growing up with her, how she was the only person who never made him feel wrong for being himself. He said after she died, he felt like he lost the one person who really got him, and he'd been acting out ever since because he didn't know how to handle that loss. I told Francis about cooking her recipes and how it made me feel close to her, but also how much pressure I put on myself to do everything perfectly because I wanted to honor her memory. Francis said Agnes would have hated seeing us fight like this, that she always wanted her family to love each other even when they drove each other crazy. We agreed to try being honest with each other going forward, to say something right away when one of us crossed a line instead of letting anger build up until it exploded. Francis asked if we could start over, not pretend Thanksgiving didn't happen, but move forward from it. I said yes, but told him he needed to actually follow through on changing his behavior, that I couldn't keep giving him chances if nothing ever changed. Francis's face got serious and he told me Colton broke up with him the week before. He said Colton couldn't handle the drama anymore, that watching what happened at Thanksgiving made Colton realize Francis was the problem in most situations. Francis started crying again and said losing Colton made him see that his behavior was pushing away everyone he loved. He'd started seeing a grief counselor 2 days after Colton left, and he was finally dealing with Agnes's death instead of just acting out. Francis asked if there was any way to fix our relationship, if I could forgive him for ruining Thanksgiving. I told Francis I already forgave him, that forcing him to eat the glittered food was my way of trying to hurt him back, and I was sorry for that. We both needed to forgive each other and figure out how to be better. Francis reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and I squeezed back. We stayed at the coffee shop until they started closing, just talking about everything that had happened since Agnes died. When we finally left, Francis hugged me in the parking lot and thanked me for giving him another chance. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in weeks, like maybe our family could actually get through this. Robert was in the kitchen making dinner when I got home. I told him about meeting Francis and everything we talked about. Robert stopped chopping vegetables and turned to look at me, his face showing relief mixed with worry. He asked if I really thought Francis would change this time. I said I didn't know for sure, but Francis seemed different, more aware of how his actions affected people. Robert wiped his hands on a towel and pulled out his phone. He said he needed to call his brother, that they hadn't really talked since Thanksgiving except for angry texts. I kissed Robert's cheek and left him alone to make the call. I could hear his voice from the living room, starting off awkward and tense but gradually getting warmer. The call lasted over an hour. When Robert finally came to bed that night, he told me he and Francis had the most honest conversation they'd had since their mom died. Francis apologized for making Thanksgiving about himself and admitted he'd been jealous of how close Robert and I were. Robert told Francis he loved him but couldn't keep defending his behavior when it hurt people. They talked about Agnes and how neither of them had really processed losing her. Robert said it felt like they were actually brothers again, instead of just people who shared parents. He wrapped his arms around me and said thank you for reaching out to Francis first, that he didn't think he could have done it without me showing him it was possible. 3 weeks later, Janet sent a message to the family group chat asking everyone to come to her house on Saturday afternoon. She said it was important and everyone needed to be there. The message made my stomach tight with worry. Robert and I drove to Janet's house together, neither of us saying much because we both knew this was going to be a hard conversation. Carl's car was already in the driveway when we arrived, and Francis pulled up right behind us. We all walked to the door together, the tension obvious in how no one was talking. Keith answered and let us in, his face serious but not angry. Janet was sitting in the living room with papers spread out on the coffee table. She stood up when we came in and asked everyone to sit down. Her voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that meant she wasn't going to let anyone derail this conversation. Janet said this year had been really hard for everyone, and she needed her family to figure out how to be together without destroying each other. She looked at Francis and then at me, her eyes making it clear she meant both of us. Keith sat next to Janet and put his hand on her knee, giving her support. Janet said she was getting married in 6 months and she wanted her whole family there, but she couldn't have another disaster like Thanksgiving. She needed everyone to commit to working on their issues and respecting each other. Carl cleared his throat and started talking before anyone else could. He said he'd been thinking a lot since Thanksgiving about how he'd been handling things since Agnes died. His voice cracked when he said her name. Carl admitted he'd been avoiding his own grief by trying to keep everyone happy, and that meant he'd been enabling Francis's behavior instead of helping him face consequences with love. He looked at Francis and apologized for not being a better father, for letting Francis think his behavior was acceptable just because Carl didn't want more conflict. Francis started crying and said he was sorry too, that he'd been causing drama for years and then playing victim when people got upset with him. He told everyone about starting therapy and working on his grief. Francis said he knew he had a pattern of making everything about himself, and he was trying to change that. He committed to working on himself and asked the family to hold him accountable when he slipped up. Janet wiped her eyes and thanked Francis for being honest. Then she looked at me and waited. I took a deep breath and said I was sorry for letting my anger turn into cruelty at Thanksgiving. I told Janet and Keith specifically that I was sorry for ruining their engagement celebration, that they deserved better than watching their family fall apart. Janet's face softened and she said she accepted my apology. She asked if I would help her plan the wedding menu using some of Agnes's recipes. The request felt like an olive branch, a way to honor Agnes together instead of fighting over her memory. I said yes immediately, feeling grateful for the chance to do something positive with Janet. Keith spoke up and said he was glad we were all talking honestly, that he'd been worried about marrying into a family that couldn't handle conflict. Janet squeezed his hand and told him this was her family trying to be better. We spent the next 2 hours talking about Christmas plans and how to move forward. We decided Christmas would be at Carl's house this year to give everyone a fresh start in a neutral location. I offered to cook some dishes, but not the entire meal, wanting to share the responsibility instead of taking it all on myself. Francis volunteered to handle decorations with the promise to run all ideas by the group first and respect everyone's input. Everyone agreed to communicate directly when someone crossed a line instead of letting resentment build. Janet made us all promise to show up for each other, even when it was hard. By the time we left Janet's house, the sun was setting, and I felt hopeful for the first time since Thanksgiving. The weeks before Christmas were different from I expected. The family group chat that had been full of angry messages after Thanksgiving started feeling more genuine. Francis posted updates from his therapy sessions, talking about what he was learning about himself. Robert and I spent evenings talking about Agnes and our own grief, getting closer through finally processing the loss together. Janet sent wedding planning updates that included everyone, asking for opinions on flowers and music. Carl posted old photos of Agnes that made everyone cry, but in a good way, sharing memories instead of avoiding them. Francis asked the group for decoration ideas for Christmas and actually listened when people gave feedback. Robert started calling his siblings more often, having real conversations instead of just checking in. I worked with Janet on the wedding menu, going through Agnes's recipe box and picking dishes that felt special. The planning sessions with Janet became something I looked forward to, a chance to bond with my sister-in-law in a way we never had before. Keith joined us sometimes and shared stories about his own family traditions, helping us blend old and new. Francis texted me directly a few times to ask advice about handling situations with friends, and I tried to give honest feedback without being harsh. Robert noticed the change in me and said I seemed less tense, more like myself. I realized I'd been carrying so much anger for so long that letting it go felt strange at first. But the more I practiced responding with honesty instead of rage, the easier it became. The family wasn't perfect, and we still had awkward moments, but we were trying. That felt like enough. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. Robert and I drove to Carl's house with dishes I'd made the night before. Francis's car was already there, which surprised me because he was usually late to everything. We carried food inside and found Francis in the living room putting final touches on decorations. They were tasteful and collaborative, exactly what he'd promised. Silver and gold ornaments hung on the tree, white lights strung carefully around the room. Francis had set up photos of Agnes on the mantel, pictures of her smiling with her family over the years. Carl stood looking at the photos with tears in his eyes. Francis came over and hugged his dad, and I saw Carl hold on to his son like he was afraid to let go. Janet and Keith arrived next, bringing more food and wine. The atmosphere felt cautiously optimistic, everyone trying but also watching to make sure things stayed peaceful. We all helped set the table using Agnes's china, the same dishes that had been covered in glitter 5 weeks earlier. This time the food looked normal and smelled amazing, multiple people contributing different dishes. I'd made the turkey and stuffing, but Janet brought mashed potatoes and Carl made his famous green beans. Francis had baked rolls from a recipe he found online, and they actually looked good. Keith brought a salad and some fancy cheese his mother had sent. We sat down to eat, and Carl said grace, something he hadn't done since Agnes died. He thanked God for family and second chances, for bringing us back together after a hard year. Everyone said amen and started passing dishes. The conversation flowed naturally, people asking Keith about his job and Francis about his therapy. Janet talked about wedding plans and asked for everyone's input on the ceremony. Robert told funny stories about work that had everyone laughing. I watched my husband with his family and felt grateful we'd made it through the worst of this. After dinner, we moved to the living room for coffee and pie. Keith pulled Janet close and told her this felt like the family celebration he was hoping for at Thanksgiving. Janet smiled and said it was better because everyone had grown. Francis raised his coffee cup and proposed a toast to Agnes, saying she would have loved seeing us all together and trying to be better. We all raised our cups and someone started crying. Then everyone was crying but smiling too. Carl suggested we each share a favorite memory of Agnes. We went around the room, everyone telling stories that made us laugh and cry. Francis shared how Agnes used to let him help her bake cookies when he was little, how patient she was when he made a mess. Robert talked about Agnes teaching him to drive, how she never got mad even when he hit the mailbox. Janet remembered Agnes doing her hair before prom, making her feel beautiful. I shared how Agnes taught me to cook, how generous she was with her time and recipes. Carl saved his story for last, talking about the day he met Agnes, and how he knew immediately she was the one. By the time we finished sharing memories, it was late, and everyone was exhausted from crying. We cleaned up together, working as a team in a way that felt natural. Francis and I ended up alone in the kitchen for a minute while everyone else was in the living room. He turned to me and said thank you for giving him another chance despite how badly he'd messed up. I told Francis I was grateful he gave me another chance too, that we were both learning how to be better family members to each other. Francis smiled and said Agnes would have been proud of us for figuring this out. I agreed and felt peaceful knowing he was right. We headed back to the living room where everyone had gathered around the tree, and I noticed Francis hanging back near the doorway looking unsure. I caught his eye and nodded toward the kitchen, and he followed me without saying anything to the others. The kitchen was quiet compared to the noise in the other room, just the hum of the refrigerator and distant laughter filtering through. Francis leaned against the counter and looked at me with red eyes. He said thank you for giving him another chance after he messed up so badly at Thanksgiving. I told him I was grateful he gave me another chance too, that we were both learning how to be better family members to each other. Francis smiled a little and said that was all anyone could really ask. We stood there for a minute not saying anything, and it felt comfortable instead of awkward. Then Robert called from the living room that dinner was ready and we walked back together. The dining room table looked beautiful with Carl's good dishes and candles Janet had brought. Everyone took their seats and started passing food, the conversation flowing naturally about work and wedding plans and funny things that happened during the year. Keith told a story about his office holiday party that had everyone laughing, and Janet squeezed his hand looking happy. Carl stood up with his wine glass and said he wanted to make a toast to Agnes, and the room went quiet. He said she would have loved seeing all of us together like this, trying to be better and choosing each other even when it was hard. His voice cracked and tears started running down his face, and then we were all crying but smiling too. Francis wiped his eyes and said he had a memory to share about Agnes. He talked about how she used to let him help bake cookies when he was little, how she never got mad when he made a mess with the flour or ate half the chocolate chips before they went in the dough. He said she would sing while they worked and make up silly lyrics that had him giggling, so hard he could barely stir the batter. Everyone was laughing through their tears, and I realized this was the first time we could talk about Agnes without everything falling apart. Robert shared a story about her teaching him to drive, how patient she was even when he backed into the mailbox. Janet remembered Agnes doing her hair before prom, making her feel beautiful. We went around the table sharing memories until the food was getting cold, but nobody minded. After dinner, we started clearing plates, and Janet pulled me aside into the hallway. She said she was glad I was going to be part of her wedding planning, that she had learned a lot from watching Robert and me work through our conflict. Janet explained that she and Keith had talked about how to handle family drama in their marriage, and our example of choosing repair over being right had helped them figure out what they wanted. I hugged her and felt grateful that something good had come from the mess we made at Thanksgiving. We finished cleaning up together, everyone working as a team and talking about plans for New Year's. Carl hugged each of us goodbye at the door, holding on a little longer than usual. Robert and I drove home through empty streets with Christmas lights still glowing in windows. I felt peaceful in a way I hadn't since Agnes died. Our family wasn't perfect, and Francis would probably always be dramatic, and I would probably always be too intense, but we had learned we could survive conflict and come back together. Robert reached over and took my hand without looking away from the road. I knew we were going to be okay even when things got messy, because we had chosen each other and this complicated, imperfect family we were building together.